Good morning. I'm going to try to bring this full circle on the issue of the commons. We've heard about the design issues, what I'll call the operational issues, the aspirational issues that communities look for. And then there's the practical issue of how to try to get it done. The first thing, we were talking about going back 100 years for train stations. As part of defining the commons, I went back 1,000 years to the Medinas and how they were the hub at the time. It's where you came to find social, cultural, and public life, and it was also a combination of the public and the private together. In the sense of the public, 1,000 years ago, you had the security of the fort was mentioned earlier, or the wall. Today, we've got our TSA wall at the airport in that same way. So 1,000 years back, we're looking at the same thing. Kurt mentioned before, you came by foot, your method of transportation to get to the marketplace, to have this interaction was on foot or by animal. Now you can bring your dog to the airport. 1,000 years ago, you brought your horse to the market. Now you have automated people movers that are essentially, driverless. You have airplanes that suck you through the sky at 500 miles an hour. You come to trade, you come to buy, you come to sell. That's why you went to the market. You had people who lived in the neighborhood and went. You had people who came from other places to participate in the market, and that's why you had the wall. You had to check who was coming into your community. You wanted that security. So whether it's the marketplace and the randomness of how there was no master planning in the Medina, it was the buildings were put all different ways, and then that formed a pattern of streets, and it was only that local knowledge that you could get through or get out. And I'll talk about that in a minute. You also had the social interaction that was part of that. And whether it's the camaraderie of the stakeholders or the shop owners with each other, how's your business going, whether it's the visitors that are coming in, it's the ability to congregate and socialize. Even though, and I was speaking to somebody last night and they were talking about how you don't go to the airport to run into somebody, yet you also, if you ever saw the movie with Bill Murray where he was in Japan and felt totally out of sorts. A lot of times people feel out of sorts, and I'm sure you've all had the experience where you sat and talked to a stranger for hours during a delay, and these kind of functions bring that feeling or that emotion out to you because you do want a sense of community. So you go back 1,000 years. Now let's focus on aviation in the commons. Does anybody know what the oldest airport in the world that's still in operation is?
Airfield or terminal? How do you find that?
Airfield. Excuse me? It's College Park, Maryland, of the whole world. It's College Park, Maryland. The airfield opened in 1909. The Wright brothers opened it, and they trained the first 2 pilots to fly a government airplane. College Park, Maryland also had the first woman passenger at an airport. It also had the first flight that went over a mile of altitude in it. And it's still operating today as a general aviation airport. So this shows you that aviation is 100 years old. The Medina that we talked about is an order of magnitude different, yet you have all those common threads that the theme of this Common Places is where you want the social, the cultural interaction, you have the business component of it. The private sector's interest in airports are public entities. They are owned by governments for the there's Branson, Missouri is one in the United States, but generally the land is owned and operated by a government entity. The airports have very significant economic impact in a region. Just as the marketplace was the hub of of our communities 1,000 years ago, the airports are just natural drivers of jobs and economic activity, which is why the public sector, both as stakeholder, participant in the current airport, and also as a partner going forward in how we're going to how we're going to achieve those aspirational things that everybody wants today in their community. It comes together. Now, I was fortunate that I started my aviation career 32 years ago working for TWA at JFK. And my first assignment was, hey kid, go in the back and put the Saarinen drawings back together again. Now, I've had interesting conversations because Tom Theobald at Fentress worked for Roach Tinkerloo, who's one of the successor firms for Saarinen, but this was my first contact with aviation, short of being on a few flights as a kid. And I think what it introduced, though, is the ability of the private sector to be a good partner in the community and with the public entities. The airlines, which represent the private sector at this time, they began funding the new airport terminals, the new public spaces, if you go back to the beginning of the jet age. So you had TWA, Saarinen at JFK, you also had Pan Am with the Worldport at JFK. And that leadership from the private sector led to some public entities understanding the value of that in what they put out to the community. And so here you understand the importance of the civic brand. I always like to tease Kurt by putting one of his pictures in my presentation. But this is truly iconic, right? When they sell the postcard in the gift shop at the airport, then this is something that became iconic in the US. This, not so much. I'm not going to tell you where it is, it's in the United States. But you could argue that this is more like the Medina, because you can see there's a hotel sort of shot in between some parking lots. There's a bunch of scramble out in the back. There's some stuff up in the foreground. And this is the other alternative. So it's about what the community wants and the community demands. And if you look at something as beautiful as the Saarinen building and think, well, the private sector did that, then it isn't necessarily that the private sector are the barbarians at the gate and the public sector always has the public interest in mind, because you can see these are two public entities and you can see the difference in what they produce. We talked some yesterday. Now let's look at, you could be very airport centric. Then we talked about the periphery, and so now you have this idea of airport as a city. I was doing work for a mayor in a city on economic development related to airport and aviation. That mayor made it very clear to me that his city was downtown. His city was not at the airport, but the airport was a component of it. And so I think if you go full cycle on airports, is what we're trying to do is, how do you decentralize the right parts, centralize the other components, and what impact can it have on the community? And then how can we use that airport to meet those aspirational goals that a community could have? This is then to take it kind of to public space, and I use it in parentheses because what I mean is, as you decentralize, what can you do with the value that your airport's created? This is St. Louis, where you have, you probably recognize the terminal above with the copper roof. You see Saarinen's mark again with the fabulous arch. And St. Louis is looking at a public-private partnership. We were going to get into that a little bit in the question, in some of the Q&A. But the airports are very profitable enterprises. They are, however, the financials are locked up by the federal government through some FAA regulation. The FAA has created a program back 20 years ago that allows a community to unlock the value that has been built in the airport and deploy it into the community on an unrestricted basis. That's where this idea then of your airport and your community coming together and to address what your aspirational goals may be come together. Few cities have the opportunity to recycle an asset. 100 airports in the United States handle 90% of the traffic. So if you think about a city and how many hospitals your city has, how many school districts your city has, and then how many airports it has, you can understand that the opportunity for this is pretty rare. The proceeds being unrestricted means it goes back to the community through its government, through its leaders, civic and business, to determine what are the priorities that we're going to address with the value that we've created from the airport. There are not many government, city councils or mayors who have the high-class problem of figuring out how to spend $500 million that comes in on one day to your city with an ongoing revenue share down the road. But this is what a public-private partnership can offer to certain airports and to meet those aspirational goals. So what you're really looking at is decentralizing the airport enterprise financially, and then trying to determine what you can do with it. In Nashville, Tennessee, they're looking at something with their airport because they have a light rail transit initiative. In St. Louis, it's after-school childcare, it's anti-violence programs, it's youth centers. You can do things with public spaces. For example, in Indianapolis, they have a rail-to-trail type program. That's part of the cultural backbone that they're trying to use to attract young people to move to the city. The key to all this is the political will to get it done, and that's the part where you can aspirationally decide what you want to do, but it's ultimately the community and the public sector that have to come in partnership with the private sector to be able to achieve these. And so that's where we sit right now with airports and the ability to decentralize and create a more common space effect through your community with some of these airports. And that's sort of where I'd like to leave the thought on this for today, because that's sort of the 1,000-year coverage. Thank you.